Dr. Mara Elion had always been different from the people around her. While most of her colleagues at the Coastal Research Station were content with routine monitoring and analyzing data, Mara's mind never rested. From a young age, she had been fascinated by the unseen world, the signals, the frequencies, the whispers of the ocean and the air that no one else seemed to notice. Her childhood had been quiet, spent in small rooms filled with books and old radios. Learning to decode messages and understand patterns, she had a natural curiosity that often bordered on obsession, and it was this very obsession that had led her to the remote station perched on the edge of jagged cliffs, overlooking the endless gray sea. The station itself was an imposing structure, a combination of steel and concrete battered by years of relentless storms. It was isolated from the nearest town by miles of rocky coastline and treacherous cliffs, which made supply runs difficult and visits from outsiders rare. Most people would have found the loneliness unbearable, but Mara felt at home there. The wind and rain that howled against the windows were not distractions to her, they were part of the rhythm of life she had chosen. Each day she would wake before sunrise and check the communication equipment, ensuring the antennas were aligned correctly and the systems were running smoothly. Even the smallest anomaly, a slight spike in signal interference or an unexpected pattern in the data, you could keep her awake at night, pondering its meaning. Humanity, at this time, was already living in a subtle state of fear and uncertainty. Strange things were happening across the globe that people could not explain. Power grids would flicker for no apparent reason, creating sudden blackouts in major cities. Ships and planes would report unusual noises or bright flashes far out in the open ocean. Entire skies would darken for minutes, without a cloud in sight. Governments issued reassurances, but the citizens noticed. Rumors spread of mysterious disappearances and secretive operations, and the media could do little but speculate. The world felt fragile, like a house built on shifting sand. And even people who had never been to Mara's station could feel the growing unease. For Mara, this was not distant news. It was a puzzle she had to solve, piece by piece, using her skills and instincts. On a normal day at the station, life was quiet but tense. The hum of the machines, the clicks of switches, and the occasional beep of distant signals were the only companions Mara had. She would sit for hours, staring at the screens, trying to separate static from meaningful data, trying to understand if there was a message hidden in the noise. Often she would get frustrated. She would slam her hand on the console or pace around the small room, murmuring theories to herself, trying to connect the dots. Many people might have found this tedious or exhausting, but for Mara it was a challenge she welcomed. Every signal, every anomaly, was like a question waiting for an answer, and she had trained herself to never ignore any clue, no matter how insignificant it seemed. Her colleagues, though competent, often lacked her drive. They would log reports and move on to the next assignment, content to let the station run on autopilot. Mara found this frustrating, but she also understood that most people were not wired like her. She had learned to work alone, relying on her instincts and intuition, and she had become exceptionally skilled at noticing patterns that others missed. She knew that her job was not just about collecting data, it was about understanding the story behind the data. Every anomaly could be a sign of danger, a signal of something far greater than anyone realized, and Mara had a nagging feeling that something was coming, something that would test the limits of human understanding and courage. The station itself seemed almost alive in its own way. The steel beams groaned under the weight of the wind, and the waves crashed against the cliffs with a force that shook the foundations. At night, the sound of the ocean was deafening, a constant reminder of the isolation and danger surrounding the station. Mara would sometimes walk to the edge of the cliffs, staring out at the dark, endless water, feeling both fear and exhilaration. It was in these moments that she felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She was not just observing the world, she was guarding it in her own small way, listening for signals that could mean life or death. She knew that if she missed something, the consequences could be catastrophic, and this thought drove her to remain vigilant at all times. Despite the tension, Mara had moments of quiet wonder. She would marvel at the precision of the antennas, the way signals traveled invisibly across vast distances, bouncing off layers of the atmosphere, reaching her station like whispers from another world. She imagined the lives connected by these signals, the ships at sea, the distant stations, the people trying to communicate across impossible distances. It was a reminder that even in isolation, she was not truly alone. There was a network of life, of information, constantly moving, and she was one of its guardians. This thought gave her both comfort and determination. She knew that her work mattered, even if the rest of the world did not yet understand it. As the days passed, Mara began to notice a pattern emerging in the anomalies. The signals that once appeared random now seemed to follow a rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. The strange disruptions, the flickering power grids, the unexplainable flashes in the sky, they were all connected in some way. She began mapping them, creating charts and logs, trying to predict what would happen next. Every night, she would cross-reference data from different locations, looking for correlations, looking for meaning. It was exhausting work, but she was driven by a deep sense of purpose. She felt as if she were on the brink of discovering something monumental, something that could explain the fear spreading across humanity. The tension at the station was not just external, it affected Mara internally as well. She often felt the weight of isolation, the pressure of responsibility, and the creeping fear that she might not be able to stop whatever was coming. Yet these feelings did not weaken her, they sharpened her focus. She reminded herself constantly that fear could not dictate her actions. She had to remain calm, precise, and determined, no matter how dire the situation seemed. This inner discipline was what set her apart from everyone else. While others might have panicked or turned away, Mara confronted the unknown with a clear mind and an unwavering will. It was this combination of skill, courage, and determination that would ultimately prepare her for the moment when the distress signal finally arrived, changing everything. The night was unusually dark, with clouds covering the moon and waves thrashing violently against the cliffs below Mara's station. The wind howled through the steel framework, rattling doors and shaking the antennas. Inside, the small control room was filled with the steady hum of computers and communication devices. Mara sat alone, eyes fixed on the glowing screens in front of her. She had been monitoring the usual signals all day, watching patterns, filtering interference, and marking anomalies. She had grown accustomed to the routine, the endless stream of numbers, the static, and the occasional faint blip, but something that night felt different, heavier, almost alive. As she adjusted the frequency dials, Mara noticed an irregularity, a faint sound, almost imperceptible under layers of static and encrypted military transmissions. Made her lean closer to the speaker. At first, it seemed like a glitch, the kind she had learned to ignore over the years. But her instinct screamed that this was not ordinary noise. The signal repeated in small bursts, like a pulse struggling to reach her through the chaos. She isolated it, amplified it, and then froze. It was a human voice, trembling and weak, but undeniably real. The words were fractured and desperate, almost like someone calling for help while hiding in the shadows. Her heart raced as she realized what she was hearing. Someone, somewhere, was alive and sending a message meant to reach anyone listening. The voice was faint and broken, distorted by the distance and layers of interference. Mara replayed it multiple times, adjusting filters and frequencies to clarify the transmission. The message mentioned a fortress and warned of imminent danger. It was impossible to ignore. The distress in the voice was clear, the panic unmistakable. Whoever had sent this message was in trouble, and the communication had been automated in some way to keep repeating, as if the sender knew they might not survive long enough to repeat it themselves. Mara's mind raced with questions. What was this fortress? Why had no one heard about it before? And most importantly, what was happening that required such a desperate warning? Mara immediately started tracing the signal. Using her knowledge of satellite paths, radio waves, and the movement of the oceans, she attempted to pinpoint the source. The coordinates that emerged were shocking. They led to a structure in the middle of the ocean, far from any known inhabited area, far from any officially recognized map. The structure was familiar to her only from classified archives she had seen years ago, a military or scientific installation, abandoned after being deemed too dangerous. The world had been told it was unstable, a relic left to decay in isolation. Yet here it was, still transmitting, still alive in some way, reaching out with a cry for help that had somehow bypassed decades of secrecy. Her pulse quickened as the reality of the situation sank in. This was not just a signal, it was a warning of something much larger. The experiments, the research, or whatever had been conducted at this fortress were clearly still active, and something had gone wrong. Mara had studied abandoned facilities before, seen the warnings ignored, and known that people often underestimated the dangers, but hearing the panic in a real human voice made it immediate, tangible, and terrifying. She felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that what she was listening to could represent a threat, not only to those trapped in the fortress but potentially to the wider world. She worked quickly, documenting everything, trying to interpret the fragments of the message. It was difficult, words were missing, sentences cut off, some phrases repeated endlessly, but patterns began to emerge. Mara noticed that certain frequencies were stronger than others, almost as if the message was trying to guide her toward something specific. She hypothesized that the distress signal was part of an automated system designed to reach anyone capable of understanding it. Whoever had set up the system had anticipated that a human might be able to respond, even if the original team could not survive. Mara realized she might be the first person in years to hear this message fully, to comprehend its meaning, and perhaps to act on it. The station, normally so familiar, suddenly felt claustrophobic. The walls seemed to close in as Mara realized how isolated she truly was. No one could see what she was seeing. No one could hear what she was hearing. If she was wrong, no one would ever know. And yet, if she was right, ignoring this signal could lead to disaster. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders, heavier than ever before. Every instinct she had honed over years of monitoring, analyzing, and decoding signals told her that this was critical. Mara knew she could not wait for permission or support. Time was already slipping through her fingers, measured in the fading pulses of the distress message. Determined to understand more, Mara pulled up every archive she could access. She reviewed old blueprints, declassified documents, and the few references to the fortress that had survived years of secrecy. Each piece of information she found raised more questions than it answered. The fortress had been a research facility for experiments that were considered highly dangerous, highly secret, and abandoned under mysterious circumstances. No one had officially returned to the site, and yet here it was, still functioning, still calling out for help, still threatening something unseen beneath the waves. Mara felt the enormity of the situation. This was no longer a scientific curiosity, it was a life-or-death scenario, potentially on a scale she could barely imagine. As hours passed, the storm outside intensified. Rain lashed against the station windows. Lightning illuminated the cliffs in brief, sharp flashes, and the wind made the antennas sway dangerously. Mara hardly noticed. She was absorbed in the task of decoding, tracing, and understanding the distress signal. Each clue she uncovered made her more convinced that action was necessary. She could not, in good conscience, report this and wait. Too much time had already passed, and the automated nature of the signal suggested that whoever had designed it did not expect human intervention to delay. Mara realized that if she was going to respond, she would need to go beyond the walls of the station, beyond safety, and venture toward the fortress herself. The thought of leaving the station alone was terrifying. The fortress was miles out in open water, abandoned, likely structurally unstable, and surrounded by natural dangers Mara could not fully predict. Yet, despite the fear, she felt a sense of determination she had never felt before. The human voice, trembling, desperate, calling for help across the ocean, anchored her resolve. She could not ignore it. She could not let fear dictate her actions. Something deep within her, trained through years of solitary work, told her that this was why she had been chosen, why her instincts had brought her to this remote station, why she had spent her life listening to signals no one else could hear. Mara spent the rest of the night preparing. She organized equipment, checked communications, plotted the route to the fortress, and reviewed every safety protocol she could remember. Every detail mattered. She knew that once she left the station, she would be on her own, facing a combination of human-made dangers and the raw, unforgiving power of nature. And yet, in the midst of this fear and preparation, she also felt a spark of exhilaration. For the first time in a long time, she felt alive in a way that transcended routine or duty. She was about to answer a call for help that might have gone unanswered for decades. She was about to step into a story far larger than herself, into a danger she had only imagined in fragments of signals and theories. As dawn approached, Mara stood by the edge of the cliffs, looking out toward the horizon where the fortress waited. The storm was subsiding slightly, leaving the sea churning in gray, a mirror of the tension within her. She knew that this night had changed everything. The faint, desperate voice from the signal had transformed her understanding of the world, of her purpose, and of the fragility of humanity. She also knew that the journey ahead would test her in ways she could not yet imagine, but she felt a quiet certainty. She would answer the call. She would trace the signal. She would confront whatever awaited her at the fortress, because she could not do otherwise. Someone was counting on her, even if they did not know it. The sea was a restless gray as Mara prepared to leave the safety of her station and head toward the fortress. The storm had passed, but the waves still thrashed against the rocks and cliffs with fierce energy, reminding her that the ocean was a force she could never fully control. She had checked her equipment repeatedly, ensuring her communication devices, navigation tools, and survival gear were ready. Her small patrol boat, battered but seaworthy, rocked gently at the dock, as if aware of the enormous journey ahead. Mara's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew the fortress was miles away, isolated in the middle of the ocean, a place abandoned for decades and likely full of unknown dangers. And yet, she could not ignore the human voice that had called for help as she pushed off from the station. The wind carried the faint taste of salt and rain. Mara gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the faint outline of the fortress loomed. It looked like a giant sentinel rising from the waves, its structure dark, angular, and imposing. The closer she got, the more she noticed its flaws. Rust streaked down the steel walls, and some sections appeared to lean precariously as if the years of neglect had taken their toll. Yet, despite its decay, there was life here, evidence in the faint blinking of lights and the low hum of machinery that somehow still operated. Mara realized that whatever had been left behind, it was not entirely abandoned, and it was still trying to function, still sending signals. The thought made her pulse quicken. Approaching the fortress, Mara's senses heightened. Every sound, every movement, became amplified. The waves crashed against the base with a thunderous roar, and she had to carefully navigate the rocks surrounding the structure. One wrong move could smash the boat and end everything before she even set foot inside. She remembered the fragments of the distress signal she had decoded, the human voice trembling with fear, warning of danger. She felt a shiver run down her spine. Whoever had been trapped here before her had faced unimaginable threats, and now she was about to walk into the same environment alone. When Mara finally stepped onto the fortress, the silence hit her like a physical weight. The sounds of the ocean seemed distant, muffled by the enormous steel walls around her. The air was thick with the smell of salt, rust, and something else she couldn't immediately identify. A faint chemical tang that hinted at the experiments that had once been conducted here. She moved carefully, every step measured, scanning the surroundings for hazards. Overturned chairs, broken consoles, and scattered papers told her that the place had been abandoned in a hurry. Evidence of panic lingered in the corridor, scribbled messages, hastily shut doors, and signs of struggle. The fortress was not empty. It was haunted by the remnants of fear, and Mara could feel it pressing down on her as she moved deeper into the structure. The faint hum of machinery grew louder. It guided her, almost like a heartbeat, pulling her toward the source of the distress signal. She followed the sound through long corridors, narrow stairwells, and maintenance tunnels. Each room seemed to tell a story. Once brilliant scientists and security teams had worked here, their lives intertwined with experiments that the world had been warned to avoid. Mara found logs and notes, partially destroyed but still legible, hinting at attempts to contain an unknown threat beneath the fortress. Her mind raced as she pieced together what had happened. The original team had faced a crisis too large for them to handle, and the automated distress signal had been their final hope, set to reach anyone capable of saving what remained. The fortress itself was a puzzle. Some areas were flooded from years of neglect, and other parts had collapsed partially, forcing Mara to navigate through narrow gaps and climb over twisted metal. The lights flickered unpredictably, and the hum of the machinery created an eerie, almost musical rhythm that echoed through the halls. Shadows danced on the walls as her flashlight cut through the darkness, and Mara felt the tension build with every step. She realized that the danger wasn't just in the machinery or the decaying structure, it was in the unknown, in what had caused the distress signal in the first place. She had to remain calm, focused, and methodical, or the fortress could claim her as it had claimed others before her. When she reached the central command room, Mara's breath caught. The room was large and filled with consoles, monitors, and wires snaking across the floor. Some screens flickered with unreadable data, others were dark, and a few showed faint schematics of the fortress and its experimental chamber below. The control panels were worn, the keys corroded, but they were still functional. Mara approached the main console, recognizing the design from old schematics she had studied in preparation. The distress signal source was here. She could see the log entries, the automated messages repeating endlessly, pleading for intervention. Her fingers flew over the controls as she tried to access the system, understanding that every second counted. Through the screens, Mara could see glimpses of the chamber below the fortress, a vast, shadowed space where some kind of experiment had been conducted. Equipment she had only read about in files hummed and whirred despite decades of abandonment. Pipes carried fluids whose purpose she could only guess, and cables snaked along the walls like metal vines. The faint vibration beneath her feet told her that the chamber was not stable, that it was active in some way. Mara realized the scale of what she had found. The distress signal had been more than a call for help, it was a warning of a potential catastrophe. Something that could affect not just the fortress but the surrounding ocean and possibly beyond. The weight of the responsibility pressed heavily on her. Mara began piecing together what had happened. The original team had been conducting experiments meant to harness or control a powerful force beneath the ocean floor. Something had gone wrong, breaching the containment systems and leaving the facility in chaos. The distress signal had been the last effort to alert the outside world. Mara understood that this was a race against time. If the systems failed completely, whatever had been contained could escape, bringing unknown consequences to the wider world. She felt both fear and determination. She was alone, but she was also the only hope of preventing disaster. Her preparation, her instincts, and her knowledge brought her to this moment, and now she had to act. As she moved closer to the chamber, the fortress seemed to react to her presence. Doors that had been closed decades ago groaned open as if sensing her approach. Machinery whirred louder, almost impatiently. The lights flickered in a pattern that seemed intentional, guiding her path, pushing her forward. Mara followed the signs, trusting her instincts and the faint signals from the system. Each step was dangerous, but she felt a strange sense of clarity. The fortress had been waiting for someone capable of understanding and taking control, and it had chosen her. The responsibility was enormous, but Mara knew she could not turn back. The human voice from the distress signal echoed in her mind, reminding her that lives depended on her. Finally, Mara reached the chamber's control area. The room was enormous, with pipes, wires, and machines extending into darkness. The hum of energy was intense, almost deafening. She realized that the containment systems were failing, and if she did not act quickly, the consequences could be catastrophic. Mara's mind worked rapidly, analyzing the schematics, understanding the systems, and figuring out a way to stabilize the chamber. The distress signal had led her here, and now it was up to her to finish what the original team could not. She felt a mixture of fear, awe, and determination. The fortress was no longer just a relic of the past, it was a living challenge, testing her courage, skill, and resolve. Mara knew that she was ready. She had come this far, and she could not turn away. Every instinct she had developed over years of listening, analyzing, and observing pointed her toward a single truth. The fortress needed someone who could understand its systems, its signals, and its dangers. She was that someone, and now it was her moment to act. The human voice from the signal had led her here, and she would not fail. Whatever lay in the shadow depths below, she was prepared to confront it, to take control, and to prevent the disaster that had haunted this abandoned place for so long. The chamber beneath the fortress was vast, a shadowed expanse of machinery, pipes, and cables that stretched in every direction, humming with energy that Mara could almost feel in her bones. The air was heavy with the smell of metal, oil, and an underlying chemical temp that made her nose sting. Every step she took echoed in the immense space, and the flickering lights created long shadows that danced across the walls. The hum of the machinery seemed almost alive, as if the fortress itself were watching her, waiting to see if she could meet the challenge it had been sending signals about for decades. Mara's heartbeat matched the rhythm of the distant mechanical pulse, and she felt both fear and determination, like a physical force pressing against her chest. She approached the main control console at the center of the chamber, the source of the automated distress signal that had led her here. The screens flickered with streams of data, some legible, others obscured by decades of decay and system corruption. The logs told a story of desperation. The original team had tried everything they could to contain the experiment below, but failures had piled upon failures. Safety systems had been bypassed, containment barriers had weakened, and alarms had been triggered endlessly with no one to respond. The distress signal was their last hope, a message sent out in the faintest hope that someone would understand it. Someone with the skill and courage to act. Mara realized that this hope had rested on her, and the weight of responsibility pressed down harder than anything she had ever faced. Every second counted. Mara scanned the data rapidly, her eyes moving from screen to screen, interpreting schematics and emergency logs. She had to understand the fortress's complex systems quickly before any further failures escalated into catastrophe. The machinery beneath the floor was unstable, and sensors indicated rising pressure in the experimental chamber, suggesting that an uncontrolled reaction could erupt at any moment. Pipes vibrated dangerously, sparks shot from worn conduits, and metal groaned as if the fortress itself were warning her of the danger. Mara's hands moved with precision, adjusting controls, redirecting power, and attempting to stabilize failing circuits. Every adjustment she made had immediate consequences, and she could feel the tension in the air increasing with each passing minute. Despite the fear, Mara's training and experience gave her focus. She analyzed every system, identifying the weakest points and prioritizing the actions that would prevent a chain reaction. She realized that the fortress had been designed to test the limits of human intervention, expecting that someone with extraordinary skill would eventually arrive. This thought gave her clarity. She wasn't just reacting to the emergency, she was orchestrating a complex solution under pressure. Guided by her instincts and knowledge, her mind worked like a machine itself, calculating sequences, predicting outcomes, and balancing risks. She felt the immense responsibility, but also the strange exhilaration of being the one capable of turning failure into success. The chamber beneath the fortress pulsed with growing energy, and Mara knew that the experiment was reaching a critical point. If she did not act decisively, the structure could collapse, releasing uncontrolled energy into the ocean. Waves of heat and vibration radiated from the floor, making her legs tremble as she worked to engage the remaining safety systems. The fortress, despite years of abandonment, seemed to respond to her actions. Doors locking or unlocking, machinery stabilizing or redirecting power based on the adjustments she made. She realized that she was part of the system now, interacting with it in ways the original team had only dreamed of. Each successful intervention gave her hope, each failure brought urgency, and the balance between catastrophe and survival felt as thin as a single thread. The automated distress signal continued to broadcast, repeating its urgent message into the void. Mara understood that this signal had not only been a cry for help but also a guide. Embedded in the code and frequency patterns were instructions, hints left by the original team, showing her how to stabilize the systems and prevent disaster. Following these hidden instructions required concentration and courage. She had to trust both her instincts and the designs left behind decades ago, piecing together the solution like a complex puzzle with lives hanging in the balance. Every decision she made had immediate consequences. A single misstep could overload the system, collapse the chamber, or trigger an uncontrollable reaction as she worked. Mara noticed that the vibrations in the chamber were increasing, and alarms she had not seen before began to flash. The energy from the experiment was unstable, threatening to breach containment entirely. She realized that the final step would require her to manually override the system, a process that meant she would have to be physically present in the control hub while the chamber stabilized. The risk was immense. Any miscalculation could result in her death, and potentially a larger catastrophe if the containment failed. Yet she felt no hesitation. She had come this far, and the lives of countless people, as well as the safety of the ocean and surrounding regions, depended on her. Mara moved into position at the main control hub, a small platform suspended above the machinery below. The platform shook with every vibration, but she held steady, her hands gripping the consoles and her eyes scanning the data. She began the manual override, carefully balancing energy flows, engaging redundant safety systems, and guiding the experimental energy back into containment. Sparks flew around her, and the floor trembled beneath her feet, but she remained calm, her focus absolute. She could feel the system responding to her actions, the chaos gradually giving way to order as she brought the energy under control. It was a tense, delicate process, each adjustment precise, each decision critical. The final moments were the most dangerous. Mara had to ensure that the containment was fully sealed while the energy stabilized, a process that required perfect timing and absolute concentration. She felt exhaustion creep in, her muscles trembling from stress and adrenaline, but she could not allow herself to falter. With one final adjustment, she completed the override. The alarms ceased, the vibrations subsided, and the machinery hummed with a steady, controlled rhythm. The experiment was contained. The chamber, which had threatened to unleash chaos, was now stable, and the fortress itself seemed to settle. The groaning metal and flickering lights calming as if in relief. Mara exhaled deeply, realizing that she had succeeded, that her courage and skill had prevented disaster. Even as relief washed over her, Mara knew her work was not entirely over. She began documenting the process, securing the system, and ensuring that any future disturbances could be managed safely. The fortress, once a symbol of fear and failure, now stood as a testament to human courage and determination. The distress signal, which had called her to this place, had achieved its purpose. It had guided her to prevent disaster and had transformed a decaying, abandoned structure into a controlled, safe environment once more. Mara understood that her actions had changed the course of events, saving countless lives and demonstrating that fear could be overcome with knowledge, skill, and courage. Finally, Mara allowed herself a moment to rest, seated at the control hub, listening to the steady hum of machinery, feeling the fortress stabilize beneath her. The weight of what she had accomplished settled in her mind. She had faced danger, uncertainty, and isolation, yet she had succeeded where others had failed. She knew that the story of this night, of her actions, and of the fortress would remain largely unknown to the world, hidden beneath layers of secrecy and classified information. But for Mara, the knowledge that she had acted, that she had prevented disaster, was enough. The fortress had tested her, and she had emerged victorious, proving that one person, determined and fearless, could make a difference even in the most impossible circumstances. Mara's body ached as she was finally lifted from the fortress, carried carefully by the rescue team that had arrived after receiving the amplified distress signal she had sent out. Her muscles trembled, not only from exhaustion but from the tension of hours spent balancing life and death decisions in the heart of a structure that had been abandoned for decades. She had faced the unimaginable, navigating the fortress alone, interpreting cryptic signals, and manually overriding systems that could have unleashed disaster if she had made a single mistake. As she breathed the fresh air outside, feeling the wind against her face, she realized how close she had come to the edge of life, and how fragile the line between survival and catastrophe truly was. Back on the patrol boat, the waves seemed gentler, the ocean calm after the storm and chaos of the fortress. Mara sat quietly, letting the rhythm of the sea guide her thoughts. She replayed every moment in her mind, the flickering lights, the groaning metal, the hum of the machinery below, and the faint, trembling voice of the original team that had sent out the distress signal decades ago. That voice had guided her, had demanded action, and had reminded her of the responsibility she carried, even when she felt small and alone. She realized that in responding to it, she had not only prevented a disaster, but had also connected herself to something larger than her own life, a story of courage and resilience that transcended time. When the rescue team reached the mainland, the world outside had already begun to grasp the significance of her actions. The amplified distress signal had triggered a rapid response from governments, scientific organizations, and emergency teams. Ships and aircraft had been mobilized to monitor and secure the surrounding waters, and experts were beginning to understand the scale of the threat that Mara had neutralized. Although most people would never see the fortress or know the details of what had happened, the impact of her actions was undeniable. The incident became a quiet turning point, a demonstration of how human courage and intelligence could prevent disaster in situations that seemed hopeless. Mara, however, did not seek recognition. She understood that the work had mattered more than the credit, and that lives had been saved because she had acted decisively in the days that followed. Mara struggled to process what had happened. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by images of the fortress, the machinery, and the moments when she had felt the pressure of time pressing against her. She replayed the decisions she had made, analyzing them for mistakes. For moments she could have done better, even though she knew she had succeeded. The weight of responsibility lingered, reminding her that the world was fragile and that crises could arrive unexpectedly. Yet amidst the exhaustion there was also a sense of pride and relief. She had confronted fear, isolation, and chaos, and she had prevailed. She had faced the unknown and emerged not only alive but victorious, proving to herself and, in a subtle way, to humanity, that courage was not about the absence of fear but the determination to act despite it. The fortress itself, became a point of intense interest for scientists and government officials. Mara's logs and data provided crucial insights into the experiment, the containment failure, and the automated systems that had continued to function despite years of neglect. Teams were sent to stabilize the structure permanently, and researchers began analyzing the potential risks of the experiment that had almost spiraled out of control. In a way, Mara had not only saved lives but had also provided humanity with knowledge that could prevent similar disasters in the future. The fortress, once a symbol of fear and abandonment, but it became a site of study, a reminder that the world held secrets, both dangerous and wondrous, that required vigilance, intelligence, and courage to manage. Mara's personal life, however, was profoundly affected by the events. She had spent years in relative isolation, dedicated to monitoring signals and understanding patterns, but this experience had shown her the magnitude of what a single individual could do. Her sense of purpose deepened, and she became more determined than ever to continue her work, to listen to the unseen signals, and to act whenever humanity might be at risk. She also developed a quiet, unspoken understanding of fear and hope, of the fragility of life and the power of action. The distress signal, which had once been a desperate plea from unknown people, that had transformed her life, giving her clarity, confidence, and a renewed sense of responsibility to the world. The broader human response to Mara's actions was subtle but profound. People began to see courage differently, not as an abstract concept or something only heroes and stories possessed, but as an attainable quality within ordinary individuals who chose to act decisively when faced with danger. The world became a little more aware of the fragile balance between safety and catastrophe, and the idea that human ingenuity and determination could prevent disaster began to inspire those who heard of the events. Mara's story, though partially hidden by official secrecy, became a quiet legend among those who studied the incident, a symbol of how one person could change the course of events when others had given up hope. Mara herself rarely spoke of the ordeal, keeping the details close, almost sacred. She understood that the fortress had been more than a physical place. It had been a test of character, intellect, and courage. The distress signal had been more than a cry for help. It had been a call to action, a challenge that demanded her full presence, skill, and determination. By answering it, she had not only prevented disaster but had also proven to herself the limits of human potential. Her connection to the signal, and the lives it represented, had transformed her understanding of purpose and responsibility. She realized that courage was not about recognition, fame, or accolades. It was about seeing a threat, understanding it, and acting when action was needed most. Over time, Mara's actions influenced how humanity approached other unknown risks. Procedures for monitoring remote structures, communication arrays, and early warning systems were strengthened. Scientific teams began considering protocols for experiments and projects that could pose global threats. Inspired in part by the example Mara had set, the world, in a small but significant way, had learned from her courage. The fortress, the distress signal, and the automated system became a case study in preparedness, response, and human determination. Mara's choice to act, alone and without waiting for permission, became a guiding principle for emergency response teams, engineers, and scientists worldwide. As the years passed, Mara continued her work at the station, but with a new perspective. She remained vigilant, always listening, always analyzing, always prepared to respond to signals that might indicate danger. Yet she also carried with her a profound sense of calm, a confidence rooted in her experience in the fortress. She had faced the unimaginable, navigated isolation and danger, and emerged victorious. She knew that fear would always exist, but she had learned that courage, preparation, and action could transform fear into strength. The world could still face threats, but humanity could meet them, and she had become living proof of that truth. In quiet moments, Mara would sometimes think back to the human voice in the distress signal, trembling yet filled with hope. That voice had guided her, called her to action, and reminded her of the value of courage and determination. She realized that it was not only a story of survival, it was a story of human resilience, of the capacity to face danger and emerge stronger. Humanity had been given a chance, and she had answered the call. The fortress, once a place of fear, became a symbol of hope, and Mara became a symbol of what one person could accomplish in the face of overwhelming odds.